I call it my amendment number 1384 and ask that it be reported by number.
Clerk will report the amendment.
The senator from Kentucky, Mr. Paul, proposes an amendment number 1384 to amendment number 1381.
Today we are gathered once again to kick the can down the road. We are gathered to continue spending money, not individually in appropriation bills, not with any real accountability for the money that's being spent, but just to keep spending. But at the rate we are spending the money, we have accumulated a $34 trillion debt. We're accumulating debt at about $1 trillion every 3 months. Let's leave it here for just a second. The spending, if you look at how we spend the money, about 2/3 of the money is spent on mandatory programs, and there are no votes on mandatory programs. They're on autopilot, growing at about 5 to 6% a year, but they consume 2/3 of the spending. So when we come before you and they say, we're going to vote on a budget, we're going to vote on spending, we're actually voting on only about 28% of the budget. That's called the discretionary spending. About half of that's military and half of it's non-military. Amongst that, to have this great agreement they came to in the military, they decided we're going to increase the military by 3%. So this big chunk over here, mandatory, we're not going to vote on it. It's going up about 5 or 6%. And then we're going to vote on discretionary, but half of that's going up at 3%. So really, we're looking at about 14% of the budget and saying, oh, we're going to try to do something. You can eliminate the 14% of the budget and it doesn't do anything to the debt. In fact, the debt equals the entire discretionary spending. So when we vote on whether it's 1.5 or 1.6 or 1.7 trillion dollars, it's all borrowed. The taxes that you pay essentially pay only for the entitlement programs. Everything else is borrowed. Why does that make a big deal? Why does it make a big difference to the average American? Because that's why your grocery prices go up. That's why your gas goes up. It's why people can't afford houses and why interest rates are high. Why? Because the Federal Reserve buys your debt, prints money, and your dollars become worth less and less. That's what inflation is. We're just days into the new year, and the Treasury Department announced that the debt has surpassed $34 trillion. The situation's only getting worse. We're spending money and borrowing at about $1 trillion every 90 days. So it used to be, I can remember before, back in the 80s when we were in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Now we're adding $1 trillion in 90 days. If that pace continues, that would amount to a mind-boggling $4 trillion added to the debt every single year. We're spending ourselves into oblivion. Since last fall, the U.S. is borrowing over $5 billion every day, over $220 million an hour, nearly $4 million every minute, and over $62,000 a second. This is literally out of control. We are destroying the dollar. We are creating inflation, borrowing $62,000 a second. Your family's share of the cost of that borrowing amounts to about $15,000 a year. Our nation's greatest threat comes not from abroad, but from the halls of Congress, which at every opportunity looks for ways to ignore our spending problem and expedite our economic decline. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office predicts that we'll add an average of $2 trillion a year in debt every year for the next decade. That's another $20 trillion in debt. You see the debt climbing, 33, 34. We're going to be up in the 50s in 10 years. Within a decade, we're going to go from 34 trillion to 50 some odd trillion. It is literally out of control. And the real world consequences are home prices are doubling, interest rates are rising, grocery prices are rising, gas prices are rising. It's not a mystery. Prices don't rise, the value of the dollar declines. The value of the dollar declines because the Federal Reserve prints up the money to buy the debt. This isn't rocket science. But you often watch the evening news and they'll go, oh my goodness, the mystery of inflation, or it's going to be transitory. Nobody's addressing the root cause. The root cause is Congress. Congress creates the inflation by running massive deficits. This reckless level of borrowing and spending is unsustainable. The ever-increasing heights of our debt mean a weak economy, high inflation, and confiscatory tax rates. In other words, today's spending threatens tomorrow's prosperity. It should come as no surprise that our financial institutions are beginning to sound the alarm. J.P. Morgan described our $34 trillion in debt as a boiling frog phenomenon for the economy and expects a debt-related recession in the next year or two. Moody's recently slashed its rating outlook on the U.S. sovereign debt. There will come a time when other countries refuse to buy our debt. There will come a time when the Federal Reserve buys all of the debt and the destruction of the currency will become pervasive. It seems that the whole world can see this coming. The warning signs, everyone can see it except for those members of Congress who are so deluded by always giving everybody everything they want, free money for all. It's only a matter of time before the world wakes up and refuses to buy our debt. We are approaching the most predictable economic crisis the United States has ever faced. And that's why I'm back on the floor today drawing attention to our out-of-control spending. Americans are starved for a voice of fiscal sanity. Americans understand better than our nation's elites that time is running out. Americans will pay dearly for Congress's inability to say no to every cause, every line item, and every pinstriped lobbyist. We will pay more to Uncle Sam in the form of taxes. We will pay more for our groceries. We will pay more for our homes. We will suffer higher interest rates. And we will find a generation of kids who won't be able to leave their parents' home because businesses can't afford to hire them. But it doesn't have to be this way. America can once again be a rising nation. We can take that first step to a brighter future today. I filed an amendment to this bill that would make across-the-board spending reductions, not just right-wing spending reductions or left-wing spending reductions, everything. You know, if we were to spend money at about 95% of what we spent last year, we could balance the budget within 5 years. It would still take 5 years. You tell people at home that that's what we ought to do. Just spend 95% of what we spent before, even if it's for good causes. We just can't do it forever. And most people would have say, well, yeah, that sounds reasonable. We're not going to eliminate government. We're just going to spend 95% of what we spent last year. My amendment would cut spending. My amendment would make this and put us on the right course towards balancing our budget. Some critics will say, but where can we cut? Where could we possibly cut spending? Well, every year, we celebrate Festivus in our office. We have an airing of grievances, and we talk about waste. Last year, right before Christmas, we presented $900 billion worth of waste, and I'll give you a couple of the highlights. This is from USAID. This is State Department spending, foreign aid spending. We sent $6 million to boost tourism in Egypt. Anybody think we don't have enough problems here at home that we should spend $6 million in Egypt promoting their tourism? And I'm sure a lot of people think this one's really worthwhile. The Defense Department spent $8,000 acquiring a lobster tank. I guess some general needed a lobster tank for his office. I have no idea why they would be spending $8,000 on a lobster tank. Now, during COVID, we passed out money like there was no tomorrow. They couldn't print it fast enough for the government to send it out during COVID. $200 billion was found to have been sent to the wrong people or to have been illegally gained through the COVID money. One of our favorites was a guy showing up or printing out his ID, and the ID was actually a Barbie doll face. He took a picture of a toy, put it on an ID, digitalized it, and sent it in for his money, and he got some. Do we have any more of the waste? All right. One of the other ones that really, I think, gets my gall, gets me up, is we spent we gave money to 1,000 dead people. we gave $1 billion to 1,000 dead people. When I came to the floor to complain about it, there was opposition, and we wanted to unanimously pass a bill allowing the COVID money givers to look at the Social Security death notices to cross-match with Social Security death notices to make sure we didn't send checks to dead people. There was an objection. Senator hurried to the floor, and his objection was that it would violate the privacy of the dead people. I kind of think the dead people's privacy is pretty much over at that point. I also think it's a terrible government policy and makes government look ludicrous at all levels to send 1,000 dead people $1 billion. I tried to get it fixed in legislation. There was opposition. Nancy Pelosi pulled it out of a bill that passed that I had it in. They finally did pass something, and they said, well, we can't go backwards. We can't get the money back from the dead people, but we'll try to do better in the future not giving money to dead people. And what did we discover? In the last year, there was still 38 million, not quite $1 billion, but there were still 38 million handed out to dead people. Throughout all of this COVID waste, both parties got going. They were giving money to everybody. Every restaurant, every arena, every movie theater was getting money. The money would run out so fast that sometimes they'd put up like $45 billion. In 2 days, the money would be gone. Oh, no, it's gone. We want to extend it. We need to give them another $45 billion. Guess what? If you give people free money, they will take it. Even people who say they're conservative and say government's having problems, free money will be accepted. But it's not free. The free money that was given out, the supposedly free money, caused the inflation. It's still causing the inflation. Nothing in life is really free. The Fed bought it, and the Fed created money to do it, and that's where your inflation comes from. And it's not over because we bought so much stuff. We gave away trillions of dollars. Throughout my time in the Senate, I've tried time and again to offer budget plans that would stem the tide, that would balance our budget. This amendment won't get a vote today, but we will have a vote on whether to continue things, whether or not to kick the can down the road and just keep spending money. But realize for those who vote to keep spending money at this level, they are voting for about a $1.5 to $1.6 trillion debt, which may well be approaching $2 trillion as this goes on. It's unsustainable, and those who vote to continue government spending at this level are responsible for the consequences, responsible for the inflation, responsible for the high home prices, and responsible for the high interest rates. I will today offer an amendment to have more scrutiny on foreign aid. Earlier in this week, there was a vote to have scrutiny on the aid given to one of our allies. And I voted for that because I believe friend or foe, whoever's getting American money, there always should be conditions. There always should be catches. We should always ask, what are you doing with our money? We should ask that it's being used honestly. I've harangued for, over 2 years now that the money sent to Ukraine ought to have an inspector general looking just at that money. In Afghanistan, we had a special inspector general, and I've tried several times on the floor, and we haven't been able to get a special inspector general for Ukraine, one of the most corrupt countries in the world. It's often said, though, that American foreign aid is to project American power and values. Unfortunately, year after year, decade after decade, the only thing consistent about American foreign aid is that the money continues to flow regardless of the behavior of the recipients. In 2023 alone, the United States government took over $43 billion of Americans' tax money and gave it away, sent it as welfare to other nations. Did the government send that money to our friends? Sometimes. But sometimes your tax dollars go to countries better described as frenemies. And often, U.S. foreign aid actually goes to countries best described as authoritarian dictatorships. The idea that we're actually looking to see if our values are being embedded or allowed or exemplified or made to show up in the countries that receive this just doesn't exist. In 2022, the U.S. sent $1.5 billion to Egypt. But Egypt is a tyrannical nightmare. The State Department acknowledges that President al-Sisi, and I use the words president loosely because he took over in a military coup, that he effectively has turned the country into a prison where security forces routinely engage in extrajudicial killings, torture, as well as harsh crackdowns on anyone who wishes to practice the right to freedom of speech. This is a regime that detains journalists for the crime of reporting, has tortured 14-year-olds for the crime of participating in public demonstration. Is this what America stands for? Are these the American values that we're pushing out on the world by sending over $1 billion to Egypt? Over the last 30 years, I think we've sent close to $60 billion to Egypt. Just a coincidence, maybe, but the Mubarak family that ran Egypt for more than 15 years ended up being worth personally somewhere between $15 and $20 billion. That's called the big skim. Your tax dollars are sent to foreign countries, they're sent to dictatorships, and guess what? The tin pot dictator takes their skim off the top. It always happens. I could give you 1,000 examples, and we never change. And people freak out and say, oh, you're going to put conditions on foreign aid? They would have to behave or have elections or not persecute their people or not, hoist up a 14-year-old by his arms and electrocute him. That's the kind of stuff that's happening in Egypt, and yet our money goes on and on. If I propose that there are conditions, oh, we can't have conditions. America just must be generous. We don't care what they do with the money, and if we don't do it, somebody else will. The Russians will, or the Chinese will. We have to give away our money, or somebody else will give them money. Our values be damned. We don't care. We look the other way, and the majority here, not me, but the majority here votes to continue foreign aid everywhere, all the time, without conditions. Today, I offer an amendment that will be conditions. Today's amendment will be conditions on aid to the Palestinians. You would think with the massacre and everything else, why would we be giving any money to the Palestinians? But it'll be interesting because I think probably the vast majority here will vote today to continue to give money to the Palestinians. But really, shouldn't they have to do something to earn the money? Shouldn't they have to at least say we believe Israel has a right to exist, or that the massacre on October 7th was a bad thing? If they can't say that, should they get any of our money? We need to know what America stands for. Why should we reward governments that have terrible human rights records? If foreign aid is to project American values, then we should write those values into the law. Let's say you only get the foreign aid if you actually are exemplifying American values. We have made such attempts in the past. For example, we have laws on the books named after Senator Patrick Leahy that prohibit U.S. assistance to countries where there is credible information that gross violations of human rights have been committed. But if our government strictly adhered to the Leahy law, it would insist that recipients abandon their despotic ways before they can receive American money. If our government actually enforced the Leahy law, which is well-intended and I support, foreign aid to Egypt would have ended years ago. There's always a loophole. There's always a presidential waiver, and they always use it. And the only thing for certain that never changes is your money will be sent to these foreign countries. There will be no accountability. The deficit will rise, but by golly, the money gets shoveled out the door every year. And there doesn't seem to be a concern for what it's doing to Americans, what it's doing to our dollar and to our economy. Unfortunately, the government always has a way around the rules. They're incredibly effective at circumventing the Leahy law. And so your money still flows around the globe, regardless of the behavior of the recipients. It may surprise many Americans to learn that we have provided hundreds of millions of dollars to the Palestinian Authority over the year. In 2023 alone, we spent over $280 million in the West Bank and Gaza. Since 1993, the United States has provided more than $7.6 billion in assistance to Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. I say not one penny more of foreign aid to countries unwilling to renounce violence. All American aid should be conditioned on recipients' practice of protecting basic human rights. I voted this way recently for one of our best allies, Israel. Their aid should be conditioned as well, not because I dislike Israel, but because all foreign aid should be conditioned on how it's spent. It's our money. It should be conditioned on human rights. It should not be too much to ask that the recipients of American aid renounce terrorism and cease trying to destroy Israel. Is that too much to ask? Are you willing to keep giving money to the Palestinian Authority that will not and has not renounced and condemned the massacres of October 7th? After these attacks, this principle is even more relevant. The atrocities committed just over 100 days ago resulted in the killing of over 1,200 innocent men, women, and children, 250 people taken hostage, at least 33 Americans were killed, and at least 6 remain unaccounted for and are presumed taken captive by Hamas. That kind of barbarism cannot and should not be rewarded with American dollars. How can we continue to allow the flow of money to groups that call for the destruction of Israel? How can we continue to allow taxpayer dollars to go to the very entities that lob rockets towards civilians in Israel? How can we reward the slaughter of innocent people? The old ways of doing business have not brought peace to the region. We have not bought peace. We don't buy off and somehow create peace, and there's all of a sudden peace because of the $7.6 billion we've given to the Palestinians. And they won't recognize Israel. They won't condemn the violence. They won't even condemn the massacre where 1,200 people were killed October 7th. The time has come for the United States to mean what it says in the defense of human rights. This is why I offered an amendment to the spending bill today that should be something every senator can support. The amendment would end American aid to governing entities in Gaza and the West Bank unless they, among other things, recognize Israel's right to exist, pledge to renounce terrorism and the October 7th massacre, terminate funding to anti-American and anti-Israeli incitement, as well as release all of the hostages abducted on October 7th. Additionally, my money requires that the Secretary of State report on Hamas and the Palestinian Authority's compliance with U.S. foreign assistance laws and any use of funds received from the U.S. that could have been involved with committing these atrocities. American resources should always promote American security interests and values. And any recipient of our tax dollars should be more than willing to adopt the principles that recognize the liberty and dignity of the individual. But we cannot expect the recipient of aid to change their behavior if America does not demand it. We speak of human rights but reward those who violate them. We can no longer afford empty rhetoric. It makes no sense to borrow money from China and turn around and give that money away to foreign countries. It is fiscally irresponsible, and it is weakening our national security. America must demand a change in behavior from those who do not accept Israel's right to exist, from those who actively seek the destruction of the state of Israel and murder innocent Israelis. To that end, I ask for a yes vote on my amendment that will end aid to Palestinian Authority. Thank you, and I yield back my time.